and welcome to the Puppet Playhouse podcast, otherwise known as the PPP, or simply for short. Now, in our last episode, we discussed role-playing, specifically Dungeons and Dragons. And this week, I want us to explore that even further by actually sitting in on a conversation with our player characters. Now, if you do decide to play Dungeons & Dragons, you will create a character. And the characters are divided up into different classes, basically a profession. And you could be a fighter, a warrior that wears armor and carries a melee weapon into battle. You could be a ranger that is part of that same class, a fighter class, but they attack with a bow or a crossbow, something from a distance. You could be a caster, like a magic user, or a cleric who is a sort of like a fighter, but because he can wear armor and use melee weapons, but he also has magic spells. Then there are rogues, thieves that are more stealthy. So typical classes that you might see in different role-playing games on computers and console, but I thought it would be really fun to kind of sit in on a conversation with some of our characters. Now, we're going to be playing, as we said in our previous podcast, in the Kingdom of Karamakos on the planet Mystara. And we're going to start out in a city called Threshold. Now, it's at the northern end of the Karamakian Kingdom. It's up against some mountains, and it's a logging community. And it's only like 5,000 people, if even that many. And it's market day, and it's the day that we're going to be playing, where there's a lot of activity, because basically they take sort of the center of town and then they set up stalls, like people, so sort of like a street fair that you might have maybe where you live. I know we have one here where I live. We have a local street fair where local artisans and craftsmen and things that make stuff by hand or whatever, they will set up a stall up and down our main street, and then they'll sell. And that's what happens here, is that people from the surrounding area and even in town will set up a stall and they'll sell stuff. And it's a walled city, similar to like a frontier fort, where you've got the giant logs that make a wall, and they're like maybe 15 to 20 foot high walls here. And so that's kind of the setting of where we are. And let's talk briefly about the characters that you're going to hear, that you're going to meet. And the first one is Amar, and he is a barbarian. Barbarians are part of that warrior class, the fighter class, meaning up close combat. They use melee weapons and they can wear armor. Though Amar doesn't wear armor. He just has a loincloth, and he's modeled after Conan the Barbarian. So think of someone who is really tall. He's like 6'4", 6'5", because in our world, the average height for a human is around 5'4" to 5'7", 5'8". So he's really big comparatively speaking, right? And he's just all muscle too. And he carries a two-handed battle axe. And he's got, dark brown hair that goes well past his shoulders. And he's, like I said, a loincloth. But he does have a leather belt around that's got a pouch attached to it. So he is really like menacing looking, and he's really, really strong, and he's really, really fast. And the fact that he's so strong and so fast, that is a reason why he typically doesn't like to wear armor, because his speed and agility and all that allow him to help him dodge attacks better. And he hits so hard, a lot of times one hit and the creature or person is, if they're not knocked out, then they're dead. So he doesn't have to worry about that. Now, he is basically a good aligned person, what we would call neutral good, in the fact that he has been more neutral for most of his life, in that he kind of has his own code that he follows. But he's traveling with a close friend, Thorin Greensleeves, who is definitely siding with what is good and right in the world. And over the years, Thorin has influenced Amar to where he is a good-natured person now, not entirely swung all the way to the good side, but he's dipping his toe in. So he's neutral good. And he's the type of person that will pull out the battle axe first, swing first, and ask questions later. And his traveling companion is Thorin Greensleeves. Now, Thorin is a half-elf. His father was a human. His mother was an elf. And he comes from the elven kingdom of Alfheim. And Alfheim was a lovely, beautiful elven forest that, if you've heard of dark elves in fantasy, well, here we call them shadow elves. And the shadow elves started a war with the Alfheim elves, and they eventually won the war, and now the elven forest is now a moor. You know, if you think of moors that you would find over in the UK, like in Britain, just kind of very dark and foggy and murky, boggy, swampy. And so he became a refugee. Elves that were not killed or made into slaves managed to escape as refugees. And he is that, and he kind of hooked up with Amar. And he is the level-headed one, where Amar fights and acts almost on emotion and impulse. Thorin is the more down-to-earth. Thorin was, at one point in his life, similar to Amar, but over time he has learned that to him fighting is a last resort. So he typically, chooses to think first, and Amar is the exact opposite, but is getting a little better because of Thorin. And Thorin, he has jet black hair that comes well past his shoulders, straight black hair, and he's also got a handlebar mustache that comes out, sort of like those silent villains from the 20s. And he's got on a green puffy shirt, Renaissance style shirt, hence his moniker, Greensleeves. And underneath that shirt is Elven Chainmail. Now, if you don't know anything about Elven Chainmail, then at least in the D&D world, in our world, it is very rare and very expensive because it's only made by elves, and it has the defensive capabilities of chainmail, which in second edition armor, you can start at a 10 where you have no clothes at all, and you can go all the way down to where if you have full plate mail and a shield, you can actually have a 0 armor class, which is the hardest to hit. Well, chainmail is in the middle of the pack at a 5. So it offers decent protection while also offering you a little more flexibility, because plate mail, with all that, those plate pieces, it can be heavy and bulky and cumbersome and difficult to move and run. But chainmail's not that bad. Well, Elven Chainmail is amazing in the fact that it gives you that defense that chainmail offers, but it feels like you're wearing silk, like a silk shirt. If you were to pick it up, it's chainmail, and you can feel the chain links, you can feel the metal, but it's as light as a silk shirt. So Thorin also has leather breeches. He's got leather pants and leather boots, and they're black. And then he's got a longsword on his left hip, and then he's got a backpack, and then he's got a longbow over his left shoulder because he is a ranger, which is part of the fighter class, where Amar is the up-close and personal type fighter. Then Thorin is we're going to attack you from a distance. Now, at the same time, Thorin is multi-class. Now, multi-class in D&D is where, and think of classes as professions, and that would mean that Thorin is a dual profession. He's got 2 professions. His first profession is a ranger. They're typically forest dwellers. They're kind of at one with nature because they kind of live and hunt in the forest most of the time. And at the same time, Thorin is a magic user. He can cast magic spells. And how that works is when you play Dungeons & Dragons, lots of things get you what they call experience points. From being in character, from fighting and killing monsters, doing different things, figuring out puzzles, solving riddles. I mean, there's so many ways you can get experience points, similar to how if you played any kind of role-playing game on a computer or even on a console, you know that you get, when you kill monsters, you're going to get XP. And as you get enough XP, you're going to level up your your characters, and when they level up, they get a little stronger. And that's kind of what happens in D&D. They get a little stronger. They get more health. It makes it easier to hit things, all of that. Well, when you have a character that has two professions, in this case, he's a fighter, ranger. He's also a magic user. Well, when he gets experience, it's going to split between the two professions. So it's going to take him longer to level up. But the end result is he's going to have two unique professions. So he can cast magic, but he can also fight with a bow or sword. So it works out great for him. Now, he's also quite agile like Amar. He's got really good speed and dexterity, so that it helps him in dodging attacks and things as well. Now, Thorin is good. He's what we call chaotic good as far as his moral compass, in that he believes that law and order is valuable and it has a place and it needs to be there. But on the flip side of the coin, there are times when the best way to serve the greater good is to go beyond the law, or to go above it, or to bend it, or to break it, or however you want to phrase that. And he is not above breaking the law if the greater good is going to be served. Now, he's not just going to flippantly do it, but if in the process of things, it's like, well, this is the only way to have that work out, he will do that and won't think twice. So we call that, at least I call that's called chaotic good. And next we have two halflings that one is Quince and one is Silas. Quince is the shorter of the two, and if you don't know what a halfling is, just think of Lord of the Rings. It's basically a hobbit. At least I think of it that way. And he's very, very lanky. Just, even though he's short, he's very thin. And he's got really dirty, kind of almost like sandy, curly hair over on his head. So it's really curly, almost like a fro, right? And he wears leather armor because he's a rogue, he's a thief, and they need armor that's gonna not make noise, but it's gonna be easy to maneuver in. And because in this game, in D&D, they have skills like they can pick pockets and they can open locks and they can find and remove different traps and climb walls and hide in shadows. All these things that if you had bulky, clanky armor would be harder to do. So that's why they wear leather. And he has that. And he also has an eye patch over his right eye because something happened years ago that caused him to not have that eye anymore. And he has pouches that are attached to a belt around his waist. And he also has a backpack. Now, Quince is very selfish and motivated by greed. And that greed sums up his personality type. He's out for fame, fortune, wealth. And he's always advertising that he's done much more than he's ever done. Now, he is neutral good in the fact that he started out much different, but over the course, he's done good deeds that have really benefited certain individuals. And so he's kind of shifted, though he's still all about money and fame and power and fortune and all of that. He's still done enough good deeds that he's kind of like Amar. He's leaning more onto the good side. And now moving on to the other halfling, Silas is Quince's longtime companion, and he's a little taller, whereas Quince is a little over 3 foot. Silas is a little taller. He's a few inches taller than Quince, but he's also much bigger, much more hefty. He probably could stand to lose a few pounds because he is quite big, because he eats and he eats and he eats and he eats. And he has leather too. And he actually wears a hat where Quince doesn't wear a hat. He wears one of those medieval floppy hats. You can look up online what the medieval floppy hat is. And he wears a floppy hat. He has a backpack, but his pouches and his backpacks are typically full of food. That's typically all about the food. And he's a very good cook, but he's always eating, whether it's something he made or something he bought. Like he loves dried fruit. And Silas is sometimes can be a little slow on the uptake. and exasperates Quince to no end. But they are close friends. Somehow they've managed to remain close friends. And Silas has his hair is kind of short. It's not curly. It's dark hair too, like dark brown. And he loves to eat. And he doesn't, whereas Quince is always bragging, I've probably done more than he really has. I've killed demons when he probably hasn't faced a demon. Well, Silas is more honest. And it's like, well, hey, we're just raising money to eventually open up a restaurant. And I'm going to call it the Halfling Hovel. So, he's sort of the exact opposite on that. But they are good friends. And then last, we have Dalvard Hardnass. Dalvard is a dwarf. He's, average height for a dwarf, about 3.5 foot tall, 4 foot tall, somewhere around in there. And he's got on chainmail, similar to what Thorin has, but it's not Elven Chainmail, it's standard chainmail. And he's got a battle axe like Amar that he attaches to his back. And he is what we might call, he's also a chaotic good as far as his moral code. He feels like that no law, as valuable as law and order is, that should not impede goodness and right. And if you have to go beyond that, he's okay. He's like, well, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And at the same time, he is always talking about family because he is not on good terms with his mother-in-law, who didn't want him to marry his wife. And she's always hitting him with a frying pan. And he loves liquor, anything, ale, mead, wine, anything in the spirits category. And he's at home at a tavern or a bar. And that's typically where you're going to find him, right? Is cooked up at a tavern or a bar, just ready for the next round. So that gives you a brief kind of look at who these characters are. And what I want to do now for these last few minutes is let's go to a typical setting, and we're going to use a tavern, the Guzzling Ogre. Now, this tavern, we'll say it's situated here in Threshold, and it's called that because the picture, like if you were to look at the sign outside the shop, it's a giant ogre. And here again, those of you who don't do role-playing, you can look up ogre, O-G-R-E, and you can type ogre in Google and get images. And it's an ogre, and he's got a big giant tankard of ale, mead, something that he's guzzling down. And that's kind of what's been carved out and painted on a sign, and it's hanging there over the shop. And inside this inn, this tavern/inn, is typical. I mean, it's got a bar at the front. As you walk in, you can see there on the left is a bar. The barkeep is a middle-aged man with receding hair, kind of going gray, and he's got 5 o'clock shadow, and he's probably 5'4", 5'3". I mean, he's kind of short, especially compared to someone like Amar. And it's full of people. Now, in our world, we need to note that here in our world, most everyone is not dressed like our players. Everyone, Amar may not have a lot of armor, but he's tall and super muscular. Looks like Conan the Barbarian, right? And he's got an axe. And then Thorin is, he looks semi-normal, but he has a long bow and a long sword. And he does have armor, chainmail underneath, but you can't see it, unless you look up close. And then the halflings are wearing leather armor, and then they have short swords. I didn't mention that, but they have short swords. And Dalvard has on chainmail, and he has a long sword. Well, not a long sword, I mean a two-handed axe. So they look like they're armed for battle. And in our world, most people don't do that because they have the watch, which is like the local police or the sheriff. They take care of me, so I don't have to do that. And you think about, these are individuals who have decided, I'm not going to have a real job. I'm not going to be a farmer or a baker or a carpenter or whatever job that is that I would have. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to learn combat weapons and tactics, get a weapon, and I'm going to go out and just wander around getting into trouble, kind of a thing. That's very unusual. I think so. And because I look at real life, and how many people do I know, or do you know in your real life, that that's what they do? That they have decided that I'm going to just shuck all life and responsibilities. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have kids. I'm not going to have a home. I'm not going to have a town to live in. I'm just going to wander, whether I wander the globe, I wander the U.S. or whatever. And I'm just going to do odd jobs. Now, yes, there are people that do that, and you may know somebody. But if you take the handful of people that you may know, if any, but you put all these people that do that up against the entire population of the world, maybe 0.1% of the entire world do that sort of thing. That's very unusual. And I think it's very unusual in our world. When you play games like World of Warcraft on the computer, or even other RPGs, whether it's on the computer, on consoles, like JRPGs, Japanese RPGs, and others, like Skyrim, they make it look like people who are adventurers. And even the game companies, like all these RPG companies that write adventure modules, they all write like an adventurer who wears weapons and armor and travels around just doing jobs. That's a legitimate profession. That there's tons of people doing it. And I've always said, not really. I don't see a lot of people doing that, because I think it's more fun if the players are in the minority, that there's not thousands, millions of people who have armor and weapons that are just traveling around getting into trouble. I'd rather it be, no, you're definitely going to get looks and stares when you walk into a town, because most people don't look and dress like you. You're dressed in whatever armor, like especially if someone's wearing plate mail armor, let's say, and you're walking into town. I mean, what? Are you riding into town? It's like what would happen if like say a special forces or a Marine in full battle gear, they've got the full on tack gear, weapons and all, and they were just walking around your town, weapons and all, not just I'm in my fatigues. No, I'm wearing my full battle gear that I would, if I'm going to be deployed overseas, whether it was Iran or Afghanistan, Iraq, whatever, I'll wear that gear and I'm just going to walk around town with it. I mean, that would get some looks and some stares, because that's just what you see every day. And that's sort of what we're talking about with our characters here, is people don't dress that way because they don't do that. Because even though a lot of people here in America, they really appreciate the right to bear arms, and a lot of people have guns or concealed carry permits and all that. If you were to poll the world and say how many people across the world are able and willing to carry a weapon, like on their person, and if something happens, they're ready to I'm ready to defend myself with that weapon. Now we're talking worldwide. I think here again, it's like what we said with the wandering, getting into maybe 0.1%. Very few people around the world, because we have governments and we have police and we have sheriffs and we have military. I mean, there's so many things that we use as modern society to keep us safe that the average person on the street doesn't do. And I like to carry that over into the Dungeons and Dragons, the D&D world, and say that most people are like, well, where I live in Threshold here, Threshold has police. They're called the Watch. And I go to them when I have trouble. They protect me. They keep me safe. I don't have to do that. And that's kind of where we're at. So what we want to do now is we want to kind of just sit in on the conversation. And we're, just to kind of let you guys hear a little bit of what a roleplay session might sound like. And it's going to be different. I mean, what you're used to. But you can almost look at it like if someone's doing a dramatic reading of an audiobook or something like that. Except every person in the game, at least for this podcast, is going to be me. I'm going to be the game master describing the setting. I'm going to be controlling all the, what we call NPCs, non-player characters. If it's not a player, it's me. But I'm going to also be the player characters here simply because I don't have any player characters. So I'm going to be those characters too. Now, in a real game setting, we would be sitting around a table, or we might be sitting around in a living room. It really doesn't matter where you play. And I've even played over Discord, and I'm currently playing over Discord. COVID, if taught me anything, it's that if you want to play, you think outside the box. And I would have told you at first that Discord was not a good role play place because, being able to look at each other and see facial expressions and look somebody in the eyes, all of that. And just being in person, you don't get that, and you can argue, well, we can do Zoom to where we can see each other's faces. But still, it's not the same as being there in the same room. But hey, it works. I will tell you, I've been doing it for several months and it works, and in a COVID conscious world, that may be the only way some of us can get together. And that also means that you can be really far away because I'm playing with people, someone that lives all the way up in New England. And then there's somebody else over here lives, there in the Midwest. And then here I am, I'm in the deep South. So we can be entirely different locations by hundreds, thousands of miles, and we can still make the role play work. And so what would happen is I encourage all my players, to get into character, just like I said in the previous podcast, as an actor. Look at this as an actor. You're playing a role, except there's no script. And when there's no script, you come up with a dialogue on the fly. You are doing everything yourself, and you're developing the character as you go. To how you play your character today may not be how he's being played 6 months from now, a year from now, because just like I hope that we as individuals and in the real world are going to grow and mature as we get older, that's what I hope that the character you play will do that. Remember what I said with Thorin Greensleeves. He started off as someone who was much like Amar. He would draw, shoot first, ask questions later. But then over time, he kind of developed into more of this philosophical, there are other ways to go about things. It's not always about fighting and pulling your weapon out. Let's not that I'm against it, but let's save that to where there's no other choice. And there are times when there is no other choice, because there are lots of monsters and creatures in the game world that don't have a moral code like that. They aren't able to process good versus evil. They just exist and they're evil and there's no way around it. And so there's no amount of talking that's going to change their mind because they can't change. And so that's kind of where we're coming from is Thorin over time changed because the person playing the character, he began to act different and think different while playing the character. So the character changed. And now who originally played Thorin? Well, that was me. That was one of my original characters. And then Amar belonged to a friend of mine who played that character for years. And then Quince and Silas started out as there were some more friends of mine that played Quince and Silas. And then when they stopped using them, I said, well, I love the characters and the dynamic that we all had together. So I decided, yes, I'm going to adapt those for my own use as non-player characters, which are, like I said, anyone that's not a player is me as the game master. And Dalvard Hardnast was another one that was controlled by someone else who was when they quit using him, I said, hey, do you mind if I take this as a non-player character? And they said, sure. And so I did. And I've adapted them over time to who they have become to be. All right. So hopefully you now have a better understanding about the characters that I use as my non-player characters, as well as player characters you might create in the world of Dungeons & Dragons as I play it. And in our next podcast, we're going to actually sit in on a faux session. Basically, I'm going to be not only the game master, controlling all the non-player characters and describing what you see and kind of what's happening, but I'm also going to be the player characters, or attempt to be all the characters, so you can kind of see how a session might unfold if you were a part of it. And before we close this podcast, I just want to make a plug for Daybreak Digital Studios, who are the audio editors for this podcast. And if you need any audio, whether it's singing or playing an instrument or cutting a song or any kind of audio editing, Daybreak Digital Studios are the studio to go with. And if they can't do it, they know the professionals who can. And please don't forget to check out Steve Trash Science. That is the PBS show that is all about science, magic, puppets, and fun. I'm the official puppeteer on that show, and we are currently working on getting season 2. We hope to begin filming sometime in 2022 at the first of the year, but you know the old saying, the wheels don't turn without money to burn. And we're looking for sponsors for the show. So maybe you know someone who might want to sponsor a kid's show that is based on real science, but also incorporates magic, music, puppets, and a whole lot of fun with some life lessons learned along the way. Then you need to reach out to Steve Trash, whether it's through YouTube or Facebook. You can definitely find him there and let him know that you want to be a sponsor, or you might know a sponsor, and he would be thrilled because, hey, it's also tax deductible, so it's a win-win for everybody. Now, if you've never seen Steve Trash, just look it up. Go to your PBS station and ask them to carry it if they don't. Or go to pbs.org. That's the main PBS website where you can find Steve Trash online. You can also go to YouTube, Steve Trash Science. You can also find it on Chromecast, Roku, or the PBS app that you can put on whatever device you are using. Lots of ways to watch, and we hope that you will watch and enjoy, and will recommend it to all your friends and family, because we want to see this take off and become something big, because we think learning can be fun, and Steve Trash Science is that. So for all of us here at the Puppet Playhouse Podcast, or for short, I'm William Freeman, and remember, never goodbye, always good journey.